Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Katie Rife.
No Time to Die is now in theaters, bringing to a close the Daniel Craig era of James Bond movies. Craig, of course, is the latest of 6 actors that have assumed the role of cinema's most famous spy. On today's episode, we welcome a very special guest to help us program a customized James Bond marathon for you, the listeners. Join us on this 6-film run through the history of Bond.
Welcome to Film Club.
Okay, folks, welcome again to a new episode of Film Club. Happy James Bond week. We have in theaters now, in many parts of the world, including the United States, obviously, there is a new James Bond movie. No Time to Die. It's the final film of the Daniel Craig run of Bond films. I know he's been saying that for, I feel like a few films now, you know? He kind of like said that about Skyfall, right? that might be his last one, and then Spectre. This one is the last one. It's the last one. That's all I'll say. But it's, you know, obviously this was, for me, this movie is always probably going to be on some level the first movie that was pushed back because of the pandemic. This was the one where I was like, oh shit, this is real.
Yeah.
You know? And
this is one they were not going to put out on streaming.
Oh yeah, no, definitely not. Yeah. But when they announced this in, I feel like it was late February. They announced that the Bond movie would not be opening because of the pandemic. That was the first moment where I was like, oh wait a minute, there's going to be some. This is going to be a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because Bond is huge, right? Like around the world. It's
Yes.
huge in the U.S., in Europe. I don't know about Asia and Africa and South America, but I know that
The global franchise, for sure.
Yeah.
So they were not ready to risk that their movie not doing well. It'll be interesting to see how well it does in this current market. You know, I mean, I feel like there's been a lot of sort of people have been putting kind of asterisks on various releases, you know? I mean, you look at something like the 2 biggest movies of the year, both Marvel movies, but neither of them have made the kind of money that you would expect the biggest movies of the year to make. So I wonder if those kind of expectations are if the producers of the James Bond series are going into this one knowing that this might not be as big of a hit as it would have been in the before times.
I mean, that's just sort of an inevitability. It's one of those things, you know, I keep seeing box office reports every Monday from box office analysts being like, why isn't the box office rebounding? And it's like, because there's still a lot of places where it's maybe not the smartest move.
Yeah, I mean, people don't feel safe going.
Yeah.
You know? I feel like we talk about this all the time on the show, but it's just, you know, it's always on our minds. And somebody mentioning the fact that I read something recently where people talking about movie-going being a habit. And that people go to the movies out of habit and have for a lot of their lives. And eventually, like any habit, you can fall out of it. So I think that's part of the fear is that people maybe might end up falling out of movie-going.
Yeah, fell out of the movie-going habit. Yeah.
Anyway, we're not going to talk any more about that today. We're going to talk about something a little bit more fun, and that is the James Bond franchise.
Yeah.
We have set up a little marathon for you to watch for those of you out there who might not have the full scope of the James Bond series in your heads. We have set up a marathon for you where we're going to discuss. Basically, we're going to discuss 6 films in the series, each starring a different actor as James Bond, spanning the whole 6 decades of this franchise. But to do that, we have a very special guest, a fellow AV Clubber, and that is Cameron Scheetz, associate video producer. Cameron, how the hell are you doing?
Hey, I'm great. Long-time listener, first-time caller. So thrilled to be here.
It's great to have you, Cam. Thank you for coming on the show. You know, the minute that I was like, let's do a James Bond episode, I was like, oh, well, we have to have Cam on.
Yeah.
He's a huge Bond fan.
And I said the same thing. We were like, okay, we're going to do a Bond episode. And I was like, it's not necessarily my wheelhouse, but you know whose wheelhouse it is. And it was a very we both said his name at the same time.
Yeah.
So.
Well, what that says to me is that I'm very annoying about my interests. So you guys were very clear on it.
It means your branding is strong. It's
sure,
a good
we'll
thing.
put it that way.
Cam, so how long have you been a James Bond enthusiast, one might say?
Yeah, for a large chunk of my life, and I usually tell people, I feel like I came to the series maybe earlier than most. I was 10 watching From Russia with Love. I don't know many 10-year-olds that were like, yes. But To be honest with you, my entry point for the Bond films was Austin Powers.
Sure.
I probably saw the first one once it hit like home video, and it had to have been one of the first. I might have my facts wrong, but one of the first PG-13 movies I saw. And I loved it, and I understood that there were all these references that were supposed to be funny. Other people were laughing, but I didn't really get them. So I was like, I need to know more. So I think at the time, the obvious point into the franchise was the Brosnan movies. I'm pretty sure that Goldeneye was the first one I watched. And then by the time Die Another Day came out in 2002, I had gone back and watched every other single one. I was all in. And it's funny to think about because there's always so many opinions about which Bond is best, which movie's best. But I was just like, it all made sense to me. I loved it all. I couldn't get enough of it. It didn't matter to me that Die Another Day is a total dud. It's not a dud. It's a camp classic, we'll say. But I was just like, at that point in my life, I was like, this is the best thing I've ever seen. I want more of it, and I want to be a spy.
Cam, there's an invisible car in it. It can't really be a dud.
Oh, well, true.
Real quick, before we move on, I want to say, maybe we can talk more about this later. But yeah, as I was watching these, Austin Powers made so much more sense to me watching this marathon. I was like, oh, that's where that came from. Oh, okay.
There's tons of specific references in Austin Powers to various Bond films, and I feel like spanning at least the first few Bonds. You know,
yeah.
I mean, obviously there's stuff like there's characters who are direct. You know, I mean. There are characters in Austin Powers who are direct parodies of characters in the Bond series. But even watching Moonraker, which is one of the films we're talking about today, a lot of that setting in Moonraker, the villain's lair is the lair at the end of the first Austin Powers as well. You know,
and there's outfits too, like on Her Majesty's Secret Service, George Lazenby wears the kilt with the sort of lace collar, and I was like, oh, I've seen that before.
Yep.
Does George wear the kilt, or does the kilt wear him?
Katie, what's your background with James Bond?
When I was in high school, I had a friend that was really into James Bond. And one time he had a James Bond marathon at his house. And that's where I saw Goldeneye and Goldfinger. We watched the Golds for some reason. And then kind of fell off with it until Spectre came out. And I was a critic by that point, so I was keeping up with movies. And I saw Spectre. So very little background. Honestly, James Austin Powers. I know more about Austin Powers than I do James Bond. Or I've seen all 3 Austin Powers movies, and I had seen 3 James Bond movies before getting into this. So I'm definitely the newbie on this episode.
Yeah. I'm probably somewhere in the middle, honestly. I don't think I've seen every James Bond movie. I grew up during the Brosnan era, which not generally recognized as one of the better eras for James Bond, and we'll get into that a little bit today too. I think talking about this whole series and talking about specifically about the Brosnan film we selected. For me, probably my biggest association with Bond, honestly, is the Nintendo 64 GoldenEye video game, which I played religiously for several years in the late 90s, and to the point where, I'm pretty sure my first introduction to Oddjob and Jaws and those iconic characters in the Bond canon was in the game, so that when I finally got around to seeing Goldfinger, as a teenager, I was like, oh, holy shit, that's Oddjob.
I think it says a lot about the ubiquity of this franchise, is that you cannot have seen very many of these movies and still know a lot of the characters and cliches just because there's been so many takeoffs and parodies and spinoffs and that sort of thing. It's just kind of in the air.
Oh yeah, cultural osmosis, big time with the Bond series. I mean, it's such a cultural institution running 6 decades at this point. You know, most of these films also have been hits. That's an interesting thing to remember, is that there have been disappointments along the way that have led to some of the reboots, but on a whole, James Bond is a reliable moneymaker.
Well, and it's another thing that a misconception I think I had before, really diving into this was that there were long periods of time in between the different Bonds, but there never was. It was 6 years was the longest pause between movies.
The most recent one.
Right. And yeah, exactly. That was wild to me to realize. It's just that because of, obviously because of pandemic related reasons, this has now been the longest period we've gone without a Bond.
Which is crazy.
Yeah. It puts a lot into perspective because I think coming into the franchise when I did, I was conscious of the fact that Goldeneye had been a wait and people were like, is Bond even going to come back? But it was a shorter period of time than what we've just been through. Mm-hmm. I can't believe it.
Yeah, it's wild. So I mentioned this in the intro, but what we're doing today is we're sort of programming a marathon for you, the listeners. And it's sort of designed to be an overview of what Bond has been for 6 decades. Now, some of you might not need this. Some of you may be as versed as Cameron is in James Bond, and some of you might not know your gold fingers from your Dr. Nose or whatever. That was a very lazy joke, I guess, question mark. But the point is we're going to be covering one film for each of the actors who played Bond over the years. And starting sort of at the very beginning of the franchise. Before we start with that, I just want to say that having done this more or less over the last few days, revisiting these films and seeing at least one I had never seen before, I wouldn't necessarily recommend you do this in one sitting.
These movies are long.
They're very long.
Like minimum 2 hours 15.
Yeah, well, I think the shortest of this bunch is just a hair over 2 hours.
Yeah.
But that's a short Bond movie.
Yeah, it is.
They're not short films.
They're big events, which is like makes it kind of remarkable how often they come out.
Yeah. Oh yeah, actually, before we start, I wanted to ask you, Cam, because you've also seen the film. Katie, I don't think you've had a chance to check it out yet. But what were your thoughts on No Time to Die?
I think it's a pretty satisfying end to a goodbye to Daniel Craig, as it were. With it being his last film, I think it really plays to his strengths as Bond, as an actor in general. As a Bond film, I kind of agree with your review, Dowd. I think that it loses some of the joys of Bond in the process of trying to make this grand send-off for Craig's Bond. I've been citing there's a middle section, and it's not really spoiling anything to say, where Bond goes to Cuba and he's at this fancy gala and things pretty quickly go to shit. It's this wild scene. We get this like one scene, to use air quotes, Bond girl in Ana de Armas's character. And she injects a lot of humor into it. There's like a brief moment of body horror. It's kind of gonzo there for maybe 15, 20 minutes. And then it kind of goes back to normal. And I found myself like missing that spark of that scene throughout the rest of the movie. I think that's kind of the fun I looked for in my Bonds. And No Time to Die occasionally delivers on that.
Yeah, to me, that scene felt like the one moment where maybe this movie was remembering that it needed to be a James Bond movie too. I mean, I'm not opposed to the idea of these movies don't all have to be exactly the same. We've had right. 6 decades of them. Everyone doesn't have to be this Pavlovian thing where it's just feeding you exactly what you want from a James Bond movie. On the other hand, he's a super spy who drives around in cool cars and uses crazy gadgets. Like this one to me felt a little too freighted with excessive import for this franchise. I know it's the last one of the Craig era. Although I will say too, it is the only Bond movie that I've ever seen that makes an awareness of the fact that the actor is not coming back, where it actually works that into the film. Because usually most of the last entries featuring the respective actors who've played Bond, there's no acknowledgement in the film that this is their last entry. Probably because producers are hoping maybe they might be able to get them back for another one.
Well, let me ask you guys a question. Mm-hmm. Do you think, I think a lot of blockbuster franchises are laden with great emotional importance in today's filmmaking climate. Do you think that this was excessively so, or the same as for example, in Fury, I think it was Furious 7 when they had the big send-off for Paul Walker? Mm-hmm. How would you compare it to something like that?
I personally think it's very much in keeping with that. A huge degree of sentimentality on the part of sort of intended for audiences, but also for the people who made the film. You know, this has to be a big send-off for Craig as well. You know, he's always saying goodbye to this character. It felt, actually, another example, it felt a lot like Endgame to me in some respects, where it's just like, this thing is all falling action. This is all punctuation on this franchise. Like, there's just so much fanfare for this being the final one, and the movie itself spends so much time telling us this is the end of this era of James Bond, and I found it wearying, personally.
Yeah, and it kind of does so without really treading any new territory in my mind. Like, a lot of these, like, I mean, how many times now have we heard Bond been told that he's irrelevant, or right. that he comes up against a villain who's like, I'm just like you? Like, that's been these Craig movies, like, at least since Skyfall. And so I think a lot of that felt played, like we've been here. So it wasn't really showing me anything new in terms of that emotional depth, the thematic pull.
So in any case, No Time to Die is now in theaters. You can go and see it and see if we're being stick in the muds about it. It does sound like Cam liked it a little bit more than I did. You might appreciate it as well if you're a big James Bond fan. I'm not huge on it personally. My review is up on the site now. You can find it and get mad at me and tweet me or something if you'd like. Cam will also have a piece on the site early next week discussing that particular sequence we were talking about, the one in Cuba. So
nice.
Look for that on the site. But let's talk about this franchise as a whole. Let's move on from No Time to Die and talk about James Bond as a whole. And let's begin our marathon, in fact. And for the first entry in this, we want to go back to the very, very start of the James Bond franchise, to Dr. No, the first James Bond movie. So yeah, Dr. No is based on the Ian Fleming novel. It's the sixth film in that series, but the first in the movie series. And what struck me rewatching the film is how minimalist it is in a lot of respects. How it really does feel like honestly maybe the smallest James Bond movie.
I could see how this was part of a book series watching it. I was like, oh, okay, I see all the elements in here. I'm not going to lie, like this film in particular, and I know Ian Fleming lived in Jamaica and all this stuff, but it's got a bit of a colonialist sheen to it where a white man needs to come from England and fix everybody's problems. And that's a little tough for me. I don't know.
It's an element that I think is in the entire Bond franchise.
Oh, for sure.
Honestly.
For sure.
I mean, Bond is a symbol of Great Britain. He is a symbol of empire building.
Yes.
You know, so it's really hard to actually separate him from colonialism and from from that aspect of British English culture, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, and I mean, as the series goes on, they try to complicate it. We'll talk about this more later, but in Goldeneye, they're kind of glib about it. But then in the Craig movies, they do take that idea a little bit more seriously about like modern Britain and post-colonial Britain. But what was interesting about this to me is that like by the early 60s, most of the empire had fallen. But in Dr. No, it's as if, you know, this whole patriarchal colonial project will go on forever. And I think that's an interesting part of the James Bond series is that they're preserving that in amber, at least throughout the 60s and 70s, right?
Yeah. I mean, you're definitely these sort of do function as time capsules of that particular period in English identity. One could say, you know, the way that part of the world sees itself. So yeah, it is interesting in that respect. I think there is some stuff in this that plays a little, maybe a little dicey through a modern lens. Maybe it played dicey through the lens of the early 60s as well. You know?
What was interesting, the 60s movies are interesting to me, and Dr. No in particular, because they have some of the things that I found the most appealing about the James Bond movies, and also the things that turned me off the most about the James Bond series are accentuated in this movie. I love like mid-century aesthetics, and oh my God, you get those so much in these 60s movies. I was in interior design heaven. This one and on Her Majesty's Secret Service. I want to live in that ski lodge and on Her Majesty's Secret Service. It's awesome. But also there's a lot of butt patting and condescension and, you know, ambient colonialists patronizing. They're very patronizing.
You know, something I remember hearing about this film in particular that I think is interesting is that Terrence Young, the director, comes into this and is like, wait, there's like a lot of violence and sex and innuendo in here. Like, I think that people are going to be really upset by this. So he kind of intentionally tried to add a little bit of a wink to this first film, and obviously the films after very much adopt that, and it just made me think like, I mean, I think the humor and the fun that we really see in these films, like that is an invention of the films. I've never actually, as big of a fan I am of the character, I've never actually read any of the Fleming novels, but it's kind of my understanding that they almost made it the joke to begin with. And obviously that doesn't really excuse anything that happens, but it's kind of, it puts it in a different a view, I guess.
Well, I'm not saying the movies are worthless or it's bad to like them. It's just that that's something that turns me off about it. I don't know.
Sure. I was just going to say, this definitely is a more stripped down Bond in retrospect. And I think it works really well for the start of our marathon. For the fact of this starts off like almost like any other basic spy movie. Like aside from the fact that Sean Connery is extremely charming and handsome in this role, it could be almost any other spy movie. Obviously, these movies at the beginning crib a lot from Hitchcock. It feels more in line with that sort of thing. But once the characters get to Crab Key and specifically Dr. No's lair, of course, it's almost like the Bond franchise steps into this fantasy that it will kind of play into for these films for years to come. It's so weird to almost like watch it become something fully different in that last third here, because all of a sudden we have this mad doctor with robot hands and a fake dragon on the beach with a flamethrower. It's like, oh my God, this just came out of nowhere.
This became a Bond movie. Yeah. You're totally right that like for a lot of it, it's kind of, there's kind of a Licari quality to it almost for a little while. We're seeing this kind of minimalist spycraft. I mean, he, like the most elaborate attempt on his life for the first hour and a half of this film is a goon attempts to puts a spider in his bed. That's like the most dangerous thing that happens to him.
Yeah, and then a guy pulls a gun on him in a bar and he like karate kicks him.
Right, yeah. So it's so low to the ground for a while, but then, yeah, you're right. They get to the villain's lair, and that is the moment when it first starts to feel really like the prototypical understanding of what a Bond movie is.
Well, the lair there, something that I thought was interesting. What I thought about when they went to Dr. No's lairs, I was like, oh, is this where Enter the Dragon got this idea from?
Oh, interesting.
You know,
Yeah,
like that
totally.
model of the martial arts movie that's like, it goes from like Enter the Dragon to Bloodsport to Mortal Kombat. The idea of like an isolated island run by a madman where people fight. Like, did James Bond kind of inspire that whole subset of movie?
I think that there's a lot of back and forth, particularly during this period in film history, and I think there's a fascinating relationship. This is a larger topic, obviously, but there's a fascinating relationship between the give and take between Western and Eastern genre films.
Oh, you could write books and books about
Exactly,
this,
yeah. I mean, you think about something like Yojimbo coming out the same decade as the second film in the Man with No Name franchise, and how similar those films are basically mirrors of each other, and yeah, I think a lot of what you see, it's interesting that I do think that a lot of Eastern cinema took some cues from James Bond, but then obviously James Bond ended up borrowing from those films as well.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, this one, I think this is a good start for the marathon, honestly, because I think it basically is like, it establishes so many of the conventions of Bond while still feeling really nascent and really unformed in some ways. Like this is a truly minimalist version of James Bond, one that is a spy movie more than an action movie, that by the end has totally sort of shifted us into what a James Bond movie will be going forward.
Yeah, like I will say that for me, you know, my initial skepticism about like the premise and the character and stuff, when they got to the island, I was like, oh, this is just goofy. I could just enjoy myself.
Yeah, totally.
And, you know, getting into the spirit of the whole thing, I was like, well, okay, you know, these movies objectify all these women, and, you know, like in the opening credits, they have, you know, naked women dancing, you know, and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to objectify James Bond.
Yes. I think the movie does too. And
that's true.
I remember specifically, which maybe we can talk about it in a second too, but in Goldfinger, there's like extended scenes of Sean Connery's Bond in just a very tiny suit. And it's like, man, they are really putting him on display. And he looks so good in the beach on that like baby blue attire. He's got his like tucked in polo. My goodness.
I was not mad about that at all. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Something you guys are saying that like So this series is maybe more tongue-in-cheek from the beginning than maybe I was giving it credit for.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Although, again, that's fluctuated over the years. And I think one of the patterns that I've noticed that stuck out to me a lot rewatching some of these films, and this is something we'll probably get into more in this episode, I think, but is the degree to which this franchise always feels like it's course correcting, and it always feels like it's responding to what came before, so that every new Bond entry, anytime a new actor takes over, it feels like the franchise kind of reboots and goes back to basics in a way. And says that first new entry with a new Bond is like, we need to strip this thing down. It got a little out of hand over the years. Let's get back to the fundamentals of what Bond is. And then obviously as it goes from there, it sort of deviates from that foundation a little bit. Even the Craig films, which I think remain sort of reliably gritty and a little bit more grounded than, say, like the Moore era or something. I mean, by the end, we're looking at it's a 3-hour sentimental, love fest. And I think that whoever takes over Bond, I think the next film in the franchise is going to be very much like, we have to get back to the fundamentals of James Bond.
Matt Berry. Make it a Matt Berry as Bond. Just make it totally stupid. That would be great.
I would love that. I did just want to throw out a very random piece of Bond movie history trivia. The fact that Terrence Young, the director of this film and the first couple Bond films, a prior movie of his was called Tank Force in the States, but that was its U.S. title. Its UK title was No Time to Die. Kind of blew my mind.
Wow.
I wonder how conscious that decision was when they were deciding to name this last one.
Probably very conscious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Yeah. I would also, before we move on to the next one, I should mention too that in the process of making this marathon, we had some discussions about what we should include. And I feel like the Connery era was one of the tougher ones in terms of determining which one would be best. We ended up going with Dr. No because it is the first film in the franchise. In some ways, it sets the template for everything that comes after it. In other ways, it looks very different and very minimalist. We also considered Goldfinger, obviously, which is kind of the consensus favorite Bond movie out there. But honestly, we could have also gone with From Russia with Love, which I think is a really fine piece of it's a really strong spy film in a lot of respects, and probably a better movie, honestly, than Dr. No. And we could have gone with Thunderball too, which I think sort of takes the Connery Bonds about as about as goofy as they go. Maybe I don't know if you disagree, Cam, but
yeah, I think for the most part, there's definitely some goofy elements to Diamonds Are Forever, but that feels like such a weird one-off coming after Lazenby's entry, which, I mean, there's your segue right there.
Yeah, there we go, yeah. So, yeah, the next film in our franchise, we had no choice to include this one. This was, this is the only one we could have picked for this particular era because Lazenby, obviously, he did one James Bond movie, and that was On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the early 70s.
What's the backstory on that? Like, why did he only do one?
Well, supposedly he hated doing it.
Interesting.
Did not enjoy the process of making the movie, but also the movie was not a huge success.
I see.
People were not crazy about his take. I think people were still very attached to Connery. I think that's actually at least with a slightly older generation, I think people never. I think a lot of audiences never really stopped seeing James Bond as Sean Connery. Yeah,
I can see that.
I almost feel like any actor who took over the role was going to face like you're not. Like Roger Moore sort of lucked out, I think, in the sense that he had a stopgap in between, he had somebody else that they could be mad at, and then audiences then from there accepted the fact that, okay, we're just going to have to deal with the fact that there's a different James Bond now.
Okay.
Okay. I feel like Lazenby sort of, he was put in the unfortunate position of having to follow like one of the more iconic performances as one of the more iconic characters in 60s cinema and maybe arguably in all of Hollywood cinema.
Yeah, and something that I even kind of noticed that you could kind of tell that the previous James Bond was very beloved and that the films were hits because this film had what you would call Easter eggs and fan service in it. And it was from 1969 when that was not as common as it is today.
Right, exactly. There's even there's a little winking self-awareness too. Lazenby, it says very early on, there's a line where he said this never happened to the other guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is very much the film winking at the fact that it knows that it's kind of a redhead stepchild right out the gate. This is such an interesting entry. It's such an outlier in this franchise, I feel like, and not just because it's a one-off. I just feel like tonally, there's like almost nothing like this in the rest of the Bond canon. Don't you think?
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, the big part of that has to do with, again, to put quotes around it, Bond girl, like what a phrase. I mean, very loaded. But for these purposes, the Bond girl of this film is Diana Rigg's character. And I mean, on one level, she's already, I mean, looking back through the franchise, she is like a much bigger star in her own right than a lot of these quote unquote Bond girls are going into the film, especially. And I think she brings a lot to it. And obviously, it really changes this character. I mean, their relationship. This is a romance in a lot of ways, with the spy narrative, spun throughout it.
Yeah, we had kind of grown accustomed to seeing James sleep around and to not get too attached to anyone. That was sort of an essential part of his character. Was he could lay on the charm with the various women he met globetrotting, but he never really got too close to any of them. And this story, it sort of feels like this one is very like the entire intention of this film is what happens when James Bond actually gets close to a woman.
Do you think that might be part of what audiences didn't like?
Yes, actually.
Yeah.
I think people were like, what the fuck is this? And also, I mean, I don't want to spoil the ending for a movie that's very old at this point, but I will say that this has to have the single most downbeat note in which this franchise has ever ended.
Oh, geez, real bummer. And they also set it up for him to be a playboy again. The self-awareness, they're like, sorry, guys, we won't do this again.
Yeah. I think so much of what one of the things I really love about the Craig films, not to get off course, but is this idea that they plant in those films that James Bond is the way he is because of experiences he has very early in his career. And the whole thing with Eva Green's character, I think, is one of the smarter aspects of the Craig films as a serialized piece of storytelling. I really love the idea that he has never been able to get over this one woman. And that feels like an extension of what's happening in Her Majesty's Secret Service, even though, as far as I know, you correct me if I'm wrong on this, Cam, but I don't think that nobody ever mentions Riggs' character again throughout the course of the series, partially because obviously there's this aspect of things constantly being rebooted, but it's not like the next Bond film in the series even acknowledges the plot of On Her Majesty's Secret Service.
Well, not specifically, but from what I remember, I think especially in some of the more movies, there are allusions to something like this happening. And I don't remember how specific it gets. They do allude to it, which obviously throws all the continuity into whack. But it maybe is supposed to have been a part of his history, no matter what version of Bond we're seeing, I guess, maybe with the exception of the Craig.
They mention it in License to Kill, because there's the wedding at the beginning and his buddy's getting married, and his buddy's wife says something about, oh, how sad, he never found love, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, well, he was married once a long time ago. Oh. There's a mention. They mention it in License to Kill.
Interesting. I wonder if that is intended as a nod to this film.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that's really interesting about this film in terms of its legacy is that, not terribly well received when it came out. Fans didn't like it. And Eon, basically, the long-standing producers of the James Bond series, were basically immediately we have to get Connery back. We have to course correct this thing. People didn't like this. Let's give them what they want again. But over the years, it has kind of become a fan favorite, I think, and it has some very high-profile defenders. Quentin Tarantino is a big fan, and supposedly when there was talk of him doing a James Bond movie, one of the many projects Tarantino has discussed doing
I feel
that
like
never comes to fruition.
Every franchise. He's at a meeting of every franchise there is.
But his notion of supposedly what he wanted to do was he wanted to do a direct sequel to On Her Majesty's Secret Service.
Interesting.
Set in the late 60s, early 70s.
Again, the interior design porn in this movie was just incredible.
Yeah, it's a beautiful looking movie.
And all the at the supervillain lair, there's all these women staying there, and they're all like quote unquote patients at his hospital, and their outfits were incredible too.
Oh yeah, definitely. I'm such a big fan of the look he wears. It's like an burnt orange turtleneck under almost like a golden zip up suit with matching slacks, not suit but like jacket layer. He looks great, and it's a very of the moment fashion, but I could see someone wearing it now.
Oh yeah, the aesthetics in this film were fabulous, and I appreciated the kind of alpine setting as well.
Yeah, it's great.
How do the two of you feel about Lazenby as Bond?
He's fine. He's not Sean Connery. To be perfectly disgusting about it, because we agreed that we're going to objectify James Bond. He's not as attractive as Sean Connery.
That's very true.
Yeah, I feel like there's been some talk about like him being a real Ken doll of a Bond, just in that he is like, of course, like handsome, but a little just like surface level.
Stiff, yeah.
Yeah, sure. And I kind of agree with that. Honestly, and this is almost a whole other tangent, but so much of my feeling about this movie is really tied up in, well, I'm a gay man that loves these movies, and so especially lately I've been very interested in like what is the queer appeal of these Bond movies, because there are a lot of other queer people that are drawn to these for various reasons. And this movie, I mean, there's an extended period of time where Bond goes undercover as a gay man. I mean, it's not ever really explicitly stated, but he is playing this gay man, and he's not doing it in a really over-the-top way. It's maybe not what you would expect from a movie from this era, like where he's playing a gay man. He's not being entirely over-the-top with it. There's just some thrown-off lines. Yes, he's in a kilt, but it's more about that being like this, like,
well, he's Scottish,
traditional wear. Yeah, exactly. It's not really trying to feminize him or anything like that. And it's, I think, also notable that this director, Peter Hunt, is I think never like openly spoke about it, but had a male partner that he lived with for years and years and years. It's like, wow, there was this queer lens on Bond with this film that I don't necessarily have the language to really even get into, but it's so fascinating to me.
Yeah, totally. I think what's interesting too, you mentioned that scene where so he shows up at the this ski resort where a lot of the action takes place. I feel like this is also an outlier in the Bond series in the fact that it is one that takes place for very long stretches in one location, which doesn't feel, that's not something that you always see in Bond films. But that stretch where he shows up and he is masquerading as this other character, and he's pretending to be gay. He comes into this room and there's all these beautiful women, and I feel like the comic stakes of that scene are not, we're going to get to see Bond do some sort of caricature of a gay person. The comic states are, can Bond keep up this masquerade
when he control himself?
Can he control himself when he's surrounded by like 12 supermodels, basically? And he actually does end up getting exposed partially because he can't control himself.
Right.
He ends up like having sex with 2 of them that night.
James Bond just gets hornier and hornier as these movies go on. Like by the time we get to like the 80s, like, wow, man, this guy.
Yeah. One of the things I find interesting about this film is the take on Blofeld. Obviously, he's the sort of iconic James Bond bad guy. He's appeared in a number of films. His most famous iteration is played by Donald Pleasance, but he also Christoph Waltz plays him in the Daniel Craig Bond films. Here he is very different than other interpretations. I feel like the version of him here is a little bit more down to earth. He's definitely more hands-on. There's an extended sequence where the bad guys are chasing Bond down a mountain where they're skiing with some really awful rear projection effects, and also an amazing, like, I have to say, you watch some of these Bond films and you think that like Austin Powers is almost redundant in that sometimes these movies parody themselves better than those films ever could. There is a really amazing moment late in this film where a goon falls off, basically he's on skis and he falls over a ledge, and he falls for what feels like 10 minutes. And we just watch him fall in real time down to the ground. It's really amazing. But my point was that the Blofeld that we see in this film is like, he's like out there on the slopes with his goons chasing Bond. He's a much more hands-on Blofeld than we've seen in previous installments.
Yeah, I think he's pretty. This is Telly Savalas. I think he's a pretty great Blofeld for all those reasons you laid out. He might be my favorite one that we've seen.
He doesn't have that. He plays him a little bit more like a person, which is always interesting. He's less of this, I am this megalomaniac character who carries a cat around and is very, he's like very much like him and Bond actually have this kind of antagonistic rapport. It's also interesting that this film suggests that they've never met before. So it really is as with, obviously with Blofeld showing up in the Craig films, it feels like they've just decided at this point, well, we're rebooting this relationship as well, I will say that I do think this is one of the most beautifully shot of the James Bond films, at least before the Craig era.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah.
Yes,
obviously, eventually you get Roger Deakins shooting a Bond movie. But I think this one has some really beautiful imagery and some really kind of offbeat and eccentric shots occasionally. And that's something you don't always – I feel like the James Bond series can be a little workmanlike at times. And this one feels – idiosyncratic and also sometimes really just gorgeous to look at in a way that not a lot of other James Bond films are.
Yeah, totally. Well, the goofiness of the henchman falling off the mountain. So I had always heard that Moonraker and Roger Moore Bond movies were kind of dumb. I had never seen these before, but I expected a different kind of silliness than I got. This was straight up Looney Tunes, Richard Lester, Hard Day's Night, speeding up the camera, kind of just trickery. And I was expecting maybe like, hammy performances and goofy costumes and stuff. But this was cartoonish in a different way than I expected. I did enjoy it. Like that double taking pigeon.
Yeah.
What the hell? Okay.
Incredible.
If you've never seen Moonraker, there's a scene where James Bond's in Venice and he's just driving a gondola through a town square, and there's all these little comic asides. Like one guy goes and rubs his eyes and looks at his wine bottle like, "Oh, am I drunk?" And then a waiter pours a beer down a guy's head because he's so surprised. Oh, look, it's James Bond in a gondola. And then they show this pigeon, and the pigeon does a double take. I'm still cracking up thinking about it because it's so dumb.
I feel like that very much captures the general tone of this thing.
Yeah,
for sure. Yes.
Cartoony as hell. Like, not just camp. Straight cartoon.
Yeah, I mean, like this entry, and I feel like a few of the more entries, but this one, to me, this one sort of feels like the height of it. Although I guess I feel like Octopussy is even goofier in some respects in this movie. But this sort of underlines the idea that did we really need Austin Powers? Because these things really, I mean, it really does almost function as a parody of the James Bond series.
Yeah.
In and of itself,
Yeah, I mean, the fact that Jaws was in a previous Bond film. He was in The Spy Who Loved Me. Jaws comes back, and it's horrifying. I do a quick aside. There's that scene in Rio where they're in the parade and Jaws is in that clown costume. That's got to be one of the more horrifying scenes in any of the Bond films.
It was creepy. Yeah, just the clown.
Deeply.
This weird, creepy, gigantic clown like slowly coming down a dark alleyway was really wild.
Turns. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really liked the Rio part. I love when... I do enjoy the globe-trotting aspect of the series, and it does get less and less, paternal and patronizing as the series goes on. And we'll talk about this more with Craig, I assume, the sort of developing idea of Britain's identity. But yeah, I really liked the Rio scene in this one. I thought it was really colorful and interesting and added a good element to it. They took way too long to get to space, by the way.
That's true. That's true. But I was going to say we get these horrifying scenes with Jaws, but by the end of the movie, Jaws is a good guy and Jaws has a girlfriend we got to throw out there.
Yeah, Jaws falls in love. He does the Jurassic Park T-Rex heel turn and goes good at the end.
I love Jaws and his girlfriend.
To spoil a Moonraker. I feel like Bond has a kind of young Frankenstein relationship with Jaws in this movie. Jaws is like the monster and he's Frankenstein, They're like kind of, he almost like when they first see each other, there's almost this like exchange of looks like, oh, I guess we're doing this again, And Bond
it's almost like an eye roll.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And Bond kind of like almost pokes fun at Jaws a little bit,
Right.
This thing, this is like the height of silliness in the Bond era, where I mean they're like parodies of other movies of the era. There's a Close Encounters parody. Much has been written about the fact that they did Moonraker trying to capitalize on Star Wars. Obviously, they were like, oh, there's an Ian Fleming novel called Moonraker. Well, we're doing that one next. And yeah, there's an extended portion. You know, people give the Fast and Furious series all this credit for finally finally going where no car movie has gone before. But Bond did this in the late 70s with Moonraker. You know?
Actually, I have the same critique of this movie and F9, which is that they took way too long to get to space. I was promised space, and I only got space. I mean, it's 45 minutes of space because these movies are all super long.
Yeah.
But still, I was promised space from the jump, man.
But the space stuff is kind of cool in this.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
really
ridiculous, obviously. There's a scene where two groups of astronauts are firing lasers at each other in space, which is amazing. But the effects are actually really good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this one, oh my gosh, maybe I should look this up before I say anything, but this was one of the few Oscar nominations the Bond series ever got for the special effects. And I cannot remember if it won, but it's like, yeah, they did a pretty great job with it, you know, for it being considered like almost like this knockoff of Star Wars. Like they really invested in making this space nonsense look pretty cool.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point about this movie is we're talking about how cartoonish it is and how it's a self-parody and all this kind of stuff. But still there was a lot of resources and effort put into it, and there are parts of this movie that are serious, like that scene in the alleyway you were talking about, Cam. Like that's supposed to be a scary scene. It's not supposed to be funny.
Yeah, there's a great fight in a museum as well. That's a knockdown, drag out fight. That's I don't know if I'd go as far as to call it serious, but it's at least a solid piece of fight choreography.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. That's kind of what I'm getting at is that like even if they were being funny about it, they still put in their best effort. You know, they weren't half-assing it, even though it is a comedic version.
Yeah, there's an aspect of craft.
And the villain in this, Elon Musk. No, I'm joking. Drax.
I did think about that.
Yeah,
but the villain is a kind of understated in a way. I think that he is pretty horrifying without having to be over the top. And obviously his like eventual plan is kind of goofy too. But I mean, they set up the stakes for how cold-blooded this man is early on. I mean, he sicks his dogs on his one assistant who sleeps with Bond pretty early on in the run. And it's like, oh, wow, yeah, right. So there's still the sense of danger to this, even if it is completely absurd, even if we get a pigeon double take.
And even his final plan does have some sinister hints to it. Like he's trying to create a master race. That's a very loaded idea.
it is.
Yeah.
And that's why Jaws turns.
Yeah, I know.
He's like, wait a minute.
Which I kind of love that it's sort of
Me too.
Jaws is like, wait a minute. Yeah, I'm not going to survive, am I?
Yeah.
Yeah, this movie's a lot of fun, honestly. And it's, again, it's about as goofy as this franchise gets, although it's been a while since I've seen Octopussy. That's the one where he actually ends up dressed as a clown at one point, right? and also where he puts on... doesn't he put on a gorilla outfit at some point in that one?
Yep, that is
Yeah.
also true.
Yeah.
And there's like, at one point, there's a little mini jet that is like covered in a horse carriage. So there's like this fake horse rear end that like lifts up. There's a lot of very absurd elements in that. I mean, he does like a Tarzan yell while he swings on a vine in the Indian jungle in that one. So, and I think that all speaks to, like, maybe not surprising to say, when I first came to these movies at a younger age, like the Roger Moore ones were my favorite. I think it was just operating on this level that I could really understand and enjoy. And there's such a like dynamism to them. So, if they're not scary, then it's funny. There's constantly something to keep, I guess, keep the blood pumping in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that across this entire franchise, honestly, is that these movies are always kind of events. And when I said earlier that maybe this isn't a marathon you actually try to do in one sitting, I meant that partially because you'll get a little fatigued doing that.
Yeah,
but
this
also,
is a solid 15-hour day if you
actually watched all these movies. Yeah, they're not short. But the other thing, though, is I think that one of the reasons that James Bond remains as popular as he is, and again, we'll see how the new film does. But I think one of the reasons Bond has remained a draw for 6 decades is that they've kind of managed to make it feel like every Bond movie is still an event, and they've done that by not oversaturating the market. You know, I mean, obviously in the early run we got, you know, a Bond movie about once a year or two, but then after that they started spacing them out a little bit more. And these days I feel like we get a Bond movie sometimes every 3 years or so, every 3 or 4 years, and that to me feels like that avoids what I think happened with the Star Wars franchise this past decade.
Oh, yeah.
Which is that people are getting getting a little burnout.
Yeah.
Something that felt like an event became like an appointment.
It used to be the type of thing where in our industry, if anything Star Wars related came out, you dropped what you were doing and wrote about it. Yeah. And now the whole Star Wars series come and go without even professionals really registering it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. But with Bond, it just feels like these things are spaced well enough and that everyone does end up feeling like an event. And I think that the movies are made in a way where they want them to be an event for audiences too. So they're these, one of the reasons they're so long is that they're so overstuffed. Everyone feels like it's trying on some level to give the audience what they came for, you know, give them a show, a night at the movies. And I felt that way about the Timothy Dalton film that we selected as well, License to Kill, even if what it's giving us is very different than what some other Bond movies have been.
So 80s. This one to me was interesting because I felt like I was seeing not just parodies of other movies, but like the influence of other 80s action films on this one. Like, you know, it's got a Death Wish element to it. But yeah, and
Miami Vice, obviously.
Yeah,
There's a lot of Miami Vice in it.
The Florida aesthetic, the machine guns, the helicopters, the whole thing. It felt very of a piece with 80s action as opposed to being a Bond movie. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, yeah. We ran a piece on the site earlier this week at the beginning of the week. An inventory basically on the various times over the years that the James Bond series has kind of chased trends and kind of ripped off other movies. And I feel like that's something that's been going on since the beginning of the Bond franchise, honestly. I mean, there's the Hitchcock elements of the second film in the series. And from there, it's just been what's going on in Hollywood action culture and what can we kind of bite on. And in this one, it's very clear that the producers were like, we need to do something that's slickly American, that's a little bit Miami Vice, maybe a little bit Lethal Weapon, that sort of captures the vibe of sort of violent and
yeah, or like a Schwarzenegger movie.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of that. I mean, this does kind of turn into a shoot 'em up at a certain point, you know. And I got to say, not one of my favorite Bond movies.
Yeah, I mean, the Dalton era is strange. I think Dalton does a great job and at really reminding you how this is a blunt instrument, as Ian Fleming once put it. This is a man who is pretty ruthless when he has to be. And obviously that's a huge change from a lot of what we saw in the Moore movies. I mean, Roger Moore like doesn't like guns. So I think that in those films, you saw him like shoot people as infrequently as possible. That is not the case here. I mean, we get so far as to, we see Bond light a man on fire. Spoiler alert, I guess, but it really leans into that side of him, and I think it kind of freaked some people out. I mean, this did not do as well at the box office, and I know over time has been written about as like the movie that almost killed the Bond franchise. But you know, in my estimation, like, well, again, in retrospect, this is a darker, brutal Bond. This is a Bond that loses his license to kill and goes rogue. Those are a lot of the pieces that are like the cornerstones of the Daniel Craig run of films.
That's a good point.
Yeah, it does kind of lay the groundwork for that a little bit. Well, at the same time, feeling like, again, we've talked about this already on the episode, but the idea that the Bond film is always kind of course correcting. I feel like it's course correcting and it's responding to previous entries. It felt in some respects like the Moore era of James Bond took Bond as big and goofy as he could go, and the Dalton era, part of the Dalton era was, can we get him back down to earth? Can we make Bond a figure of some grittiness again, of somebody who we could actually see shooting somebody, of a soldier again? And I think it does that successfully. I will say that he's kind of he's a little glowery for my taste, and I know that the Craig Bond has aspects of that too, but Craig, I think, has done a really good job of balancing the charm of James Bond as a character with his kind of brutishness as a blunt instrument, as Fleming put it. Dalton, I think, only kind of gets the blunt instrument aspect of it, in my opinion.
Dalton was the first James Bond where I could be like, yeah, I could see this guy being like a surly drunk. Like,
yes,
you couldn't see Connery as a surly drunk? I definitely could.
Yeah, all right, fine.
There was one moment of like goofy Moore era humor in here that I needed to call out, because I'm like, wait, did that just happen? Where Dalton's Bond is scaling down the side of a building, and as he puts his hand on like the bust, like the chest of a bust of a woman, like on the side of the building, sculpted, a horn honks in the background. And I was like, wait, what? Doesn't really fit with the rest of the film. I also wanted to mention that I do quite like the stakes here, the way that they play with stakes. You know, this isn't like so many of the Bonds before it, where the fate of the world lies in his hands, or, you know, the villain is trying to like get two nations to go to war with each other so he can achieve some other goal. Like, this is really just about greed and someone trying to push drugs across borders. And I like that it's a little smaller scale, and I think you still do get like this pretty terrifying villain in Robert Davi's Sanchez. And then, of course, we have Benicio del Toro, young Benicio del Toro, looking fantastic in here. To me, this kind of represents the shift in the franchise from these like craggly-faced character actor villains to like actual, like, I think from here on out, every Bond villain is pretty damn attractive too. With Bond, if we're gonna keep objectifying.
Yeah, I mean, I watched this one and I think that this feels like an exercise in how far can we stray from Bond and it still is James Bond. Do you know what I mean? Like, this one, in a lot of respect, I mean, I understand why audiences were kind of turned off by this one, because it really does feel, there are aspects of it that don't feel very James Bond. I mean, it does feel like an American action movie in a lot of respects. But there is still that core foundation, you know, that it does still have the conventions of James Bond in it at its core. So it's interesting to see the franchise see how far it can stray from some of the tropes and at least some of the environments of a standard Bond movie, and how much audiences will accept that.
I will say, though, that, like, you know, watching them, like I watched this one on Monday and then Skyfall yesterday. In my opinion, I feel like the Craig movies did a much better job with the sort of revisionist elements. I think it had a more mature grasp on the revisionist elements of James Bond than I think this movie did. But it did kind of set the tone, you know, for all that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of a Bond that actually is a little bit more serious, a little more violent.
Personal stakes.
Personal stakes, yeah, totally. Yeah, because, I mean, he is kind of on a revenge mission in this one.
Yeah.
Which you don't see very often, you know?
Poor Felix Leiter. his legs were shark bait.
Yeah, okay. Can I ask one more question? What's up with people being like turned into dog food in James Bond movies? Because there's the guy that goes in the snowblower and on Her Majesty's Secret Service, and then in this one there's like the concrete mixer, and it's just people being just blended into goop. It comes up a lot in these movies.
Well, I don't know. That would suck, wouldn't it?
I mean, it's cinematic, sure.
I mean, is there like a worse thing a villain can do to a person than like fucking slice them up into pieces? I don't know.
I guess not.
Yeah.
That is like one of those things with the movie. Well, one, no villain henchman has good aim. They're never able to shoot Bond. So it always has to come to something like this. And yeah, sure, that wasn't Bond hanging over the shark tank, but it always has to come something like this where there's like the possibility he could escape. Because all these villains love to I don't know, there's something, they get some sort of pleasure out of that, I think.
It literally reminds me of the Batman, just like the Close Calls reminds me of the Batman TV series from the 60s. Because Batman, in every single episode, it was always something like, oh, Batman's about to get run through this giant oven. And you get those similar type of close calls in these James Bond movies.
Well, I think there's a real, honestly, you mentioned that. I think there's actually a real relationship between Batman and Bond, too, in terms of how the movies have played and in terms of that sort of rebalancing that happens occasionally between how dark should this go versus how goofy. I think that Batman has probably some of the Batman properties have probably borrowed a little bit from James Bond and possibly vice versa as well. I mean, particularly once you get to the Craig era, I think the Craig era of James Bond is very influenced by the Nolan Batman films.
Oh, big time, for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's. So you said that License to Kill almost killed the Bond franchise. Or that's something that they said. There was a slightly longer break between that one and the next film. Which is when Pierce Brosnan took over the role. And Goldeneye came out in 1995 and kind of the first Bond that I remember being aware of as a child, honestly. It was the first one that was on my radar. I was much too young before Goldeneye to even be aware of Bond as this cultural institution that was happening in real time. But Brosnan took over, and Goldeneye is, I would say, probably the sort of consensus favorite of the Brosnan era, which in retrospect I don't think is all that well regarded.
This is one I had seen before. I kind of hated this movie.
Oh, interesting.
I didn't really like it on a second watch. I just felt like it was gritty and glib in the wrong ways. Like its blend of gritty and glib was like just I didn't really like it. It was more cartoony than I remembered, and like, I don't know, it just wasn't as fun as like Moonraker. I don't know. I didn't really like this one that much watching it again. But I did really like Pierce Brosnan as James Bond. I think he's a good James Bond.
Interesting, because I really don't like him as James
Really?
Bond. Yeah. And I actually think he's the worst thing about the film. In some
Really?
respects. Yeah.
Really? I think the worst thing about the film is Famke Janssen, that Xenia Onatopp.
No
I didn't. She was
love her.
I'm sorry, but just her making those sex noises whenever she kills somebody was so stupid. It was so stupid. I'm sorry.
I mean, it is.
For sure.
You're like, this is bad?
I think it's a pretty wonderfully over-the-top villain performance in this franchise.
I guess so, but they're also, like, they don't go full stupid. Like, it has all these ridiculous, campy elements to it, but it also wants to be a more serious spy film at the same time.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting to note that like the bulk of the script was originally written for Dalton. I think there was a question for a long period of time of whether or not he would return, and they eventually decided he wouldn't. So they went to Brosnan, who was, well, to go further back, was a potential pick back before they picked Dalton. Anyway, I think that's like maybe speaks to a lot of the grittiness you were picking up on, and I don't know, maybe some of the cartoony elements were in there, but it does kind of feel like we're trying to push these two worlds together. Now, This is where I just fully say that this is my all-time favorite Bond. So it's upsetting to hear you don't like it, Katie.
I'm
but
sorry.
I think a big part of it, sure, probably could chalk it up to nostalgia, but it is just a really fun balance of the camp and the like danger, the threat of danger. That is what I want in a Bond, and I think that this plays them both, turned all the way up, and I think it's a blast.
I do think it's definitely an attempt at bridging those eras in some respects. And the Brosnan films would get goofier from here, and I feel like the particularly his last two, The World Is Not Enough and Die Another Day, kind of take that over the edge. But there is a kind of sense that it's trying to recapture some of the fun of the Moore era, while at the same time not completely tilting back into that sort of anything goes silliness, which is the kind of tightrope it tries to walk. Successfully, I don't know. I mean, maybe sometimes not. But I do think there is an aspect of like this one feels like as the first one of the Brosnan era and as a kind of reset for the franchise, who is James Bond? What do we want out of a Bond movie? And how can we give that to people? That feels sort of very much at the forefront of what this film is trying to do.
Yeah, and I mean, there's obviously bringing Judi Dench in as M is a huge thing, and that would have a huge impact on the series going forward. There's a lot of talk with her and Bond in this about how he is a relic and he doesn't really fit in. And that was, again, the concern that, like, what does Bond make sense in a post-Cold War world? Well, this movie's solution was, like, what if the Cold War didn't have to end? Like, there's basically, like, the villain's plot is, like, trying to extend it, basically. Which, again,
it's truly
the villain,
it, yeah.
Yeah. The villain, played by Sean Bean, Alec Trevelyan, I think is a pretty brilliant move. And this is like really the first time where we see this, like the villain have these close personal connections to Bond.
I was going to ask
his work. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he's 006. We meet him at the beginning, and it's really cool to see Bond working with someone else. Like, you've heard mention of other 00 agents in the past, but like to see him in the field with another agent at the beginning is, I mean, unless I'm mistaken, this is the first time that you really get to see them working together. He is, of course, pretty quickly dispatched until later on we find out it was all a ploy. And God, I think Sean Bean is like really, really, really great in this.
We get that third man reveal about halfway through the movie where he kind of steps out of the shadows and it's him.
Yes.
You know? And I do like that. I do like the idea of this because, you know, the way that over the course of this franchise, we've sort of seen the way that MI6 sees people like Bond as fundamentally disposable. You know, they exist to protect their country, and if they die in the line of action, well, they sort of knew the risk going into this line of work.
Well, why do they keep reinstating him if he's disposable?
Do you mean Bond?
Yeah. He goes on like leave, and every single one of they're like, you want too far, James Bond? And then he goes on an exotic vacation that's actually an extra top secret spy mission.
Well, Katie, he's the best.
But then he's not disposable.
I guess what I mean is M is never going to wring her hands too much about losing an agent in the field.
Okay.
If somebody dies.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You know, which I
mean,
think
there are life and death stakes. This is true.
Yeah. So the notion that like you basically serve at the pleasure of your country, and if you die, well, again, that was something that could happen in this line of work. And I think that this feels like, in the Craig movies would revisit this, and the next film we're going to talk about, in fact, feels like it's actually kind of, to some extent, updating or riffing on the very idea that this film runs with, which is, you know, what if you're a disgruntled agent, basically, somebody who's been left for dead by your government, and you turn on it. I do think it's a smart idea.
I think it's an interesting thematic shift, and it does kind of, to me, correlate with the end of the Cold War. That without, you know, without that Cold War kind of ever-present villainous threat, you know, the easy one to go to, where do they turn? And they turn internally, you know, to where are we going to find the threat now? And it turns internally. And I think that's a smart shift, I think.
Yeah. I agree. You know, this franchise has been self-aware for its entire run. I feel like very early on, it was already kind of winking at the idea that there were certain tropes in James Bond, and already kind of from the very start asking if James Bond was an outdated concept even, or an outdated character. This one makes it explicit in a way that you can sort of feel the growing pains of this franchise. I mean, that whole scene that you were talking about between Bond and M, where she's saying you're a relic of the Cold War. She says you're a sexist, misogynistic dinosaur, is what she says to him. That feels like the furthest this franchise has gone to acknowledging actual critiques people have had about James Bond as a character. And it kind of wants to have its cake and eat it too.
Yeah, that was kind of my issue with it, was that it's very it says all that stuff but in a very glib way that is immediately just it's like, you know, they're like, yeah, we know, but then they go ahead and do the thing anyway.
Yeah, like Moneypenny at a certain point is like, you know, the way that you talk to me could be construed as sexual harassment.
Yeah. But I like it.
Yeah, the thing that basically says,
okay, girl.
Make good on your innuendos, basically, you know? So I think at a certain point these movies can get self-aware, and they can question the values in the sort of ideals of James Bond, and they can question his sexism, and they can question some of the more outdated ideas about the property. But in the end, if you're going to do a James Bond movie, you ultimately have to do a James Bond movie. So they can only take that critique so far, because ultimately they're still going to want to deliver James Bond.
Yeah, and something that I noticed, like, as these movies went along, and, you know, going through the decades in a short period of time like this, is actually starting with On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the woman always drives.
Wow.
Whatever woman he's working with is always driving. And he's always in the passenger seat. And I think that's sort of a and then as you go along, the female agents that he works with, you know, participate in the action more and more and more. And I could sort of see that as like a, you know, sign of the changing times.
Yeah, I mean, you can you can sort of see the way that even the franchise was questioning the notion of what a Bond girl is, you know, and you know, it's not as though they stopped being sex objects at any point. I mean, this is a fundamentally objectifying franchise in that respect.
It's chill, man. Like, you know, like if you're a man and you like women, I could totally see you thinking that this rules. This would be like the best thing ever. You know what I mean?
They have been very diligent over the years about casting some of the most beautiful women in the world.
Yeah. Who
is the latest, most beautiful woman in the world? She's in a Bond movie.
Totally. You can also see the evolution of beauty standards.
Yeah, totally.
By watching a wide swath of Bond movies in a short period of time.
Totally. You're right, though, that I think that the degree of proactivity and the degree of competence and the degree of, one might say, ass-kicking action proficiency.
Yeah, agency. Just general agency.
Totally.
Yeah,
it fluctuates over the years, and I do think that we've seen some very. I mean, there are Bond girls, for example, that Bond doesn't sleep with, you know, and there are a few of them over the years. Not a ton, but there are some, you know.
I mean, maybe we can say our runner-up Brosnan pick is Tomorrow Never Dies, which gives us Michelle Yeoh as an incredible foil to Bond. She is amazing, and I mean, you know, I would watch her in her own spin-off series.
Totally.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I actually think that might be a better movie than Goldeneye, to be honest. I think it has a kind of cooler villain too. Jonathan Pryce plays this kind of Rupert Murdoch figure who is he basically is he's the head of this media conglomerate. He's this big media mogul, and his plan is to basically create the news and then have a scoop on it because he's creating international incidents so that they can be first to report on it.
Like Peter Parker being Spider-Man, so he's always there to take pictures.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of, yeah, in a way. Yeah.
The original clout chaser.
I just wanted one more note on Brosnan, and I just Cam. I mean, I know you say this is your favorite one. I don't know how you feel about Brosnan as Bond himself in this franchise. I personally, I think he might be my least favorite, to be honest, because he, to me, feels like the one who's the most, this kind of received wisdom of who Bond is. It's like he looks the part, and he's kind of eternalized some of the qualities that we've come to expect from Bond, but there's no there. I look at this Bond and I don't see a personality. I don't see that soul that some of the other characters could put behind his eyes in a way. You know, you look at the various Bonds and you can describe them in different ways and say, you know, the Moore version is kind of cheeky. The Connery one is sort of brusque in some ways. Obviously, the Craig one's a little bit more tortured. I look at Brosnan.
Lazenby's.
Yeah, exactly.
You totally weren't even going to mention.
I was just going to brush past Lazenby, I guess. I don't know. Dalton is more intense, I suppose.
Yeah.
Brosnan, I just see somebody who got the part because he embodies certain generic qualities that suggest James Bond. And I feel like his take on the character has always just been a sort of general smarm.
Yeah, I read it as like a cool detachment, both like in character and just like what he brings to the performance. Looking back on these, it does feel harder to get invested in him as a character. But, you know, I think there are people that would argue that like that is almost what a Bond movie should be. It's almost like Bond is the least interesting element of these movies where we have these absurd plots and villains that want to generate buzz in the news and Bond girls that kick ass in their own right.
Yeah, like gorgeous women, gorgeous locations, you know, just a feast for the eyes. Yeah.
That's a good point. To me, he just kind of feels like a placeholder. Like, okay, you needed Bond. It's almost like the iconic, the Bond walking, you know, through the view scope and turning to fire the bullet. He never deepens Bond past that silhouette of him. Almost, you know, but you're right. Maybe that is what this series needed at this time in its run.
Yeah, for the 90s.
Exactly. Yeah. Maybe it just needed to redeliver Bond, like not even repackage him. Just give people their memory of who Bond is. It's almost like Brosnan is playing people's memory of James Bond.
That seems kind of a piece with pop culture of the 90s to me, though.
Yeah. So Goldeneye is obviously directed by Martin Campbell. He came in and successfully rebooted the franchise. It was a big hit. When it came time, when Brosnan got tired of playing Bond and it came time to reconceive the franchise, Campbell was brought back to do what's my favorite Bond movie, Casino Royale. And I think we easily could have talked about that film today. And I think that for me is the one Bond movie that I think fully lives up to everything you could want from a James Bond movie. Mm-hmm. But we're not going to talk about that one. In part because I think that as a good marathon ends on a note that feels somewhat conclusive. And for me, and I'll tie this back to No Time to Die, for me, the Craig era of James Bond could have very safely ended with Skyfall. Because I think Skyfall to me feels like a kind of perfect punctuation. Honestly, I mean, we're never probably ever going to see an end to the James Bond franchise. Because it continues to make money, it will keep going. But I think that Skyfall, if they wanted to close the book on James Bond for good, Skyfall feels to me like the ideal punctuation.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of said this at the beginning when we were talking about No Time to Die, but we're seeing a lot of these ideas here of Bond coming to term with his own past. And I mean, God, we go back to his childhood home at the end here for a sequence that I'm going to stump for because I think that's incredible. I've seen a lot of comments lately say it's just Goofy and Home Alone, but
no way.
I love
that sequence is awesome.
That's not true
It's
at
so
all.
awesome.
It's assault on Precinct 13, as they all are.
Straw Dogs.
Oh, there you
Dogs.
go. There's that too. Yeah, because it's the countryside.
Yeah,
for
exactly.
Sure,
Yep.
for sure.
But we're getting so many of these themes that again we just kind of drag them back out again for the next two Bonds after this, where we're talking about like, is he even relevant? And again, Silva as this villain that is this like cracked mirror image of who Bond is really fascinating. And I think like what we end up learning of the villain in the last movie, it feels like they try to do that too, but it just doesn't cohere in the same way. God, Javier Bardem is a blast to watch.
He's so good in this movie.
Yeah.
I thought he did a wonderful job of bringing a little bit of that old camp villain to the whole thing while still being genuinely kind of a freaky dude.
Scary.
Yeah, he's a scary dude. Like there was hints of Hannibal Lecter in his performance. I felt like that. I thought was just really effective. And there's so many interesting details about that character, like the fact, like the blonde hair and blue eyes, like even just that, like choice, you know, when you pair it with like, you know, his Spanish accent, it kind of shows you somebody who's always trying to be something that he's not, and it really fits with the character. I thought, honestly, you guys, I loved this movie. I thought it was so good. I was like, oh, I could watch this movie 6 times. I loved Skyfall.
I'm a big fan of this one too, and I remember when it came out in theaters, and most people seem to really like this one. It's one of the best reviewed. It's also, I think, to this day, the highest grossing Bond movie. I feel like there's at least a small contingent of the Bond fan base that feels that this one is a little bit too self-aware and a little bit too intent on apologizing for the fact that it's a Bond movie.
Or breaking down all the stuff, all the thematic stuff that we've been talking about.
Instead of just you know, like the notion of just letting something be what it is, this one has to be something else. But again, after 6 decades, I think maybe it's okay to have a Bond movie that's trying for something else.
Yep.
I remember sitting in the theater and watching this and thinking that I was seeing the first Bond movie that really seemed chiefly interested with being a work of art. You know?
I mean, the cinematography is just amazing. Roger Deakins, the cinematographer, very, very well-regarded cinematographer. There's a couple scenes in here. You know, a lot of movie. Another question I have about like the origin of different cliches is you see a lot of action movies nowadays that have a sequence set in an abandoned building in China where you have like, I mean, Shang-Chi had a sequence like this, and it's done so artistically here.
Yeah.
So well done here.
Stunning.
Stunning. And then when he goes to the casino, stunning.
Yeah, the
Beautiful.
use of color throughout is brilliant. Like I have like such like stills of this movie like emblazoned in my mind, and it's just like the bright red of the Macau casino, the blue of the Shanghai backlit scene, the like I guess the gray at the end, but it works so well. It's got that style that I really want from these movies.
Yeah, like spoiler alert, the flaming house at the end of the movie, the way he lights them, you know, standing in this field lit by like a building on fire behind them it's like poetic. It's beautiful.
Right from the first shot of the movie, which is a play on that, we don't get the standard Bond walking across, sort of stiffly across the frame, turning into the viewfinder and firing the bullet.
They're definitely announcing that this is a different Bond.
Yeah,
story.
they incorporate that particular iconography into the opening shot of the movie, which is Bond coming in out of focus in the background of the scene, that familiar sting of music, and then he comes into the foreground. And it's just immediately a Bond that gives a shit about, again, over the course of this franchise, there's been some very good filmmaking, but I feel like there's also been a lot of filmmakers who have just kind of said, let's not overthink it. It's James Bond. So long as people can tell what's going on, the stunts are good, the locations look good, the people on screen look beautiful. It's fine. This is a movie where you could tell that Sam Mendes, the director, and Deakins, the cinematographer, really thought about how can we make this the most gorgeous, visually exciting version
Yeah,
of
totally.
Bond.
Yeah, and right, because you do get all that stuff you're talking about, plus it's visually satisfying. The woman that we meet in the Macau casino, she is just so pretty.
Oh, yeah.
I was really blown away by her.
Yeah.
Cam,
Cheekbones.
Oh my God, there's the cheekbones in this movie. Good Lord, yeah.
Cam, I'm interested in something because you said earlier in the episode that you were interested in Bond as kind of a gay icon in the way that the series has dealt with that over the years. This is a film that I feel like kind of openly talks about that a little bit. There's one nonchalant line in this that implies that Bond's sexuality may be more fluid than he's previously suggested.
Yeah, that sent the gears turning in my mind. I was like, Bond is bi? Oh my God. Yeah.
Well, listen, if you're bisexual, these movies are just a treat. Because, all kinds of pretty things to look at.
Especially during the Craig era, where I feel like Craig is
Right.
probably the most ogled Bond body of them all. I mean, Casino Royale, they flip the Ursula Andress coming out of the water thing. They flip that in Casino Royale, where it's Craig who comes out of the water.
But like Ken was saying, Sean Connery wears some pretty revealing outfits.
He does.
too.
He does. It's true.
Yeah, that suit is kind of a throwback to what Connery was wearing in those movies. I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I mean, obviously, there's probably been a lot said about Silva being kind of a queer-coded villain
He
too.
is,
and
yeah.
I mean, it feels like pretty direct flirting in that confrontation, which that's another amazingly shot, composed scene with him walking down the hallway as he's monologuing. Like, my God,
It's like a mirror of the first scene because he comes in. It's exactly like the way that Craig comes in from the far background and walks into the foreground. When Silva is introduced, I mean, he's this mirror image of Bond, obviously. He walks in. It's a long take where he comes in the door and he walks all the way across the room into the foreground.
It's brilliant. But yeah, I mean, it's not so much to me that like I need Bond to plainly state that he is queer, but I love that there is this tease in here, and it's like, why wouldn't he be? He's a thrill seeker, a pleasure chaser. Like, I don't know, like I know that's not what it's all about, but like there's no reason for him not to be, and I like that the movie kind of, I guess, winks at that.
Kind of hints at that, yeah. And
mm-hmm.
I definitely think the villain in this one is definitely queer coded.
Oh, big time.
Yes.
But I also think that line that Bond says, he says, because Silva in that moment is supposed to be, he's essentially trying to sexually threaten Bond, in a sense, basically.
Yeah.
And Bond sort of nonchalantly saying, "What makes you think I'm your first?
You're my first, yeah.
I think that moment is also designed to diffuse potential gay panic in that moment as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think it's supposed to say that Bond is too cool to feel gay panic.
Yeah, to be threatened by this.
Right.
And I think, something I've mentioned a few times, and maybe now we can get more into it, is I feel like these are the most thematically mature out of all the Bond movies. Mm-hmm. Like, they put a lot of thought into all these types of themes, and the way that they deal with, like, Britain's fading empire in this one, I thought was very thoughtful as well.
Maybe to a fault, though, a little bit, at least in the ones that come afterwards. Because I feel like the two after Skyfall, Spectre and now No Time to Die, feel almost like they're a little bit too up their own ass about all that stuff.
Okay, fair enough.
Skyfall feels like the ideal balance, because I do think that one of the things that makes it one of my favorite Bond movies is that it's winking at some of the outdated notions of what a Bond movie is, and getting into some of the themes of collapsing empire that you were talking about, while at the same time still giving us what we might want from a Bond movie.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, there's some good thrills.
Right.
But yeah, it is interesting how it kind of I mean, all of like the spammy pop-ups that Silva like puts out into the world. There's the Union Jack iconography there, and it really kind of tries to put a lot of the fault of things in M's lap. And God, I mean, this movie makes Judi Dench's Bond girl, if you want to put it that way.
In a lot of ways,
she's so crucial to this, and yeah, that's the real relationship here, is her relationship with Bond. But, you know, also just M being the symbol of the Empire and of kind of the old ways of doing things, where Britain felt like it could just run rampantly across the world and do what it wanted.
Totally. There's some real tension, actually, because in a sense, Craig's anger towards her is mirrored in Silva. Silva is somebody who is angry at M for essentially the same reasons that Bond is at the beginning of the film. You treated me like this weapon you could just throw away.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think it's really interesting to see that. I mean, another reason that I don't much care for No Time to Die is I feel like it's doing something that the that Skyfall did better, honestly, is this idea of a Bond who is off the grid, who is not James Bond anymore, coming back into action. I really love the portion of the movie that is a kind of bitter and rusty Bond. You know?
Oh, when he's quote unquote dead?
Yeah, well, when he comes back to MI6,
I see.
And he's not as good a shot as he used to be,
Yep.
and he's really pissed at M, and I feel like that gives those early scenes a tension that we don't often see in these movies, and No Time to Die kind of repeats that to some extent, but it's just not as effective in my opinion.
Yeah.
Okay, so that folks is the marathon. These are not necessarily the best Bond films, although some of them are. I think that's more just sort of if you wanted to get a notion of what James Bond has been over 6 decades, I think these 6 films would give you a really good sense of that, honestly. And I just want to end the episode today by asking both of you. I'll start with Katie. Katie, who is your favorite James Bond?
Oh, wow. By what standard? Like, as a character, I like Craig the best, but in terms of like as a symbol, as like a masculine symbol, I would go with Sean Connery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean Connery kind of there's a reason that people have never been able to totally forget Connery, and that's why he's still. I asked my dad yesterday. Actually, sent him a text last night. I was watching the last 2 that I had to watch before we did this, and I asked him who his favorite Bond was, and he said Connery, and then he said, I don't know, maybe more a distant second. And like to him, it's Connery and it's everybody else, you know. Wow. And I think that Connery just sort of embodied what we think of, and maybe it's the fact that he's the first, you know, and that he did it so well right out the gate. But like the idea of Connery as somebody who He strikes that really good balance between being charming and being kind of being someone you could imagine killing people for a living.
I think if you had Connery back in the day working off of a Craig script, it would be like the ideal James Bond movie.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. I would love to see someone. I mean, gosh, Connery is my favorite, I guess, ultimately because he does just toe the line so well. You are kind of aware of his ruthlessness and his skill, but it all feels fun and tongue-in-cheek. He just plays it so well. There's like a wink to everything he does, but not in the way that like Roger Moore is almost literally winking at the camera. You know, it's a lot more subtle, and it is. Yeah, he was there at the beginning, and he really defined what the role is. And I think, you know, Craig does really well by not trying to replicate that in any real way and really making Bond a character of his own. Which, by the way, again, Craig is fantastic. And as much as what I do like about No Time to Die is that you just really get a sense of how that character has changed and grown, and he's just built. Like, I think he's just only grown into that performance and become more comfortable with it over time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to be boring, but I think it is those two, honestly. Connery also delivers I feel like the quintessential James Bond moment, and it's right there in Dr. No. I mean, when he's at that poker table,
his introduction? Oh, yeah, that was good.
Yeah, I mean, there's like no actor has ever delivered that line. Even Connery himself has never delivered it as well as he delivers it in that moment. It's such an iconic introduction to the character.
Yeah.
It's interesting to think that like audiences had never met James Bond before, movie audiences anyway, but he feels legendary immediately, you know? And maybe I'm bringing decades of knowing who James Bond is and being of cultural osmosis, which we talked about, or just maybe audiences in 1962 or whatever, maybe they felt differently in that moment. But you see him and he just seems like a legend immediately. The minute he appears on screen.
Speaking of the cultural osmosis thing, shaken not stirred is something that it was really interesting watching this and seeing the different way that line is used. And sometimes it's used as a shorthand for we've been spying on you because we already know what your favorite drink is. And then later on in Skyfall, they don't even say it. It's just like the lady at the casino in Macau is shaking a martini and he goes, perfect. Like they don't even have to say it anymore at that point.
the Craig series played on that early on. And obviously we talked about Casino Royale for a minute. The premise of that one is we're seeing Bond pretty much on his first mission. It's an origin story. And there's normally I don't like these kind of winks because they just feel a little bit too fan servicey for me. But there's a moment in Casino Royale where the bartender asks him what he wants, and he says a martini, and the bartender asks, shaken or stirred, and he goes, "Why should I give a damn?"
Yeah, brilliant.
Yep.
I mean, there's a fine line in that. I mean, gosh, Skyfall's probably most cringeworthy moment is when Naomi Harris's character finally at the end of the film introduces herself as Eve Moneypenny. It's like, okay,
I just hate those moments.
That feels
in
very
modern
Dark Knight Rises.
It was a little retrograde
X-Men
too.
First Class, you know.
Yeah, and I thought
retrograde too. Yeah.
In terms of character, it was kind of retrograde because it was I'm just gonna sit here and wait for you to pay attention to me, James Bond. It was very 60s, you know.
I think if I ultimately
he did Moneypenny dirty in those 60s movies, by the way.
Oh yeah, no,
yes.
she's ready to go.
Yeah, and he just will not. He just won't even take her to dinner. It's not cute.
Are we ever going to see the two of them hook up? Probably not, right? That would break the magic of it, right?
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, it is. Those sorts of things are frowned upon in 2021.
Yeah, they are.
They're coworkers.
Yeah, you'll notice that the Moneypenny and Craig banter in the recent films is a little less sexually charged.
It's very sexually charged in the 60s ones.
Yes.
I was like in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, he walks in the room and grabs her butt. I was like, okay.
All right.
Different times, man. I actually want to ask you guys one question. There was a news story recently where Daniel Craig said that he doesn't think there should be a female James Bond because he thinks that there should just be better roles for women. And I actually, after watching all these movies, I came to agree with him. Because I think that because James Bond, what he is a symbol of, I think that just putting a person of color or a woman into that role that embodies, for better or for worse, like the white hetero patriarchy, like just sticking, someone else in that role seems like it would be a very shallow example of representation to me.
I guess I would say I do more or less agree. I mean, I think that for it to even make sense, the character would have to be fundamentally reconceived. Mm-hmm. I don't think it could just be suddenly a woman is doing all the things.
All the James Bond things. Yeah.
Right, exactly. The whole franchise, I think, would have to be reconceived beyond, because otherwise you're right that I think it would just be a kind of a shallow, transparent play for representation. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think if we are going to see a Bond who is not just the standard British white guy, I think that we would have to see a genuine transformation of the franchise. I sort of don't disagree with him that maybe we could just have other roles in different movies and better.
That's a bit of a pie in the sky statement, I will say, that we are way more likely to cast a woman in that role than we are to create a whole new franchise for a female secret agent.
Fair enough. Yeah.
I mean, anyway.
It's to me, what's so interesting is that obviously we talk about this series, this franchise, as the James Bond franchise, the 007 franchise, but I mean, you look at the titles, it's not like they're ever 007 in or 007 : Octopussy,
Mm-hmm.
It's like...
True.
As much as we talk about them as a whole squarely about James Bond, like No Time to Die, if you just read that without knowing it was a Bond movie, if you just read that title, I mean, you would have no idea. So I think that kind of, to me, speaks to the fact that we're in this place where again, there are so many tropes and things that these series are known for that we could put a full new character in this mold, and I think it would still work.
Like the 008 series, right? Like it's a different
almost.
character.
And
yeah.
I'm hesitating to say certain things because I don't want to spoil anything else. But
tread lightly.
Maybe we'll just leave it at that. Yeah,
okay.
Maybe we'll just leave it at
that. Okay. Once again, a special thanks to our guest, Cameron Scheetz. And if you'd like to know all the spoilers that Cameron couldn't talk about on our podcast, No Time to Die is in theaters, well, everywhere. And if you'd like to rent the other films that we talked about today and do your own James Bond marathon, they're available for digital rental or free with ads on Pluto TV. And while you're at it, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to Film Club wherever you get your podcasts.
This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by Katie Rife. It was produced by Carl Blomberg. Our sound mixer and finishing editor is Zach Goldsboro. And our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. Stay tuned next week. We'll have a brand new episode talking about the Halloween franchise. Thanks, folks.
Bye.